Beneath the ashes of Rome's greatest rival lies a mystery so dark it was almost erased from history itself. Carthage, once a glittering empire born of the Phoenicians, rulers of the seas, masters of trade, and architects of power, vanished in fire and blood. But why? Was it destiny, betrayal, or the ruthless hand of Rome that brought them to their knees? Tonight, we journey into the shadows of a civilization wiped from the face of the earth, yet still whispering through ruins and forgotten chronicles. They called it Carthage, the new city. From its harbors stretched fleets that carried riches across the Mediterranean. From its markets flowed gold, silver, ivory, and spices. And from its heart rose generals whose names echoed across centuries. Carthage was not just a city. It was an empire. But empires rise only to fall, and this one fell harder than most. The Romans vowed that Carthage would be destroyed forever, and they made good on their promise. What happened in the deserts of North Africa that turned this thriving civilization into nothing but dust and memory? Before we uncover the secrets of Carthage's rise and catastrophic fall, make sure to subscribe to History Vault, your gateway to the lost, the forbidden, and the forgotten stories of our past. Beneath the glowing sun of North Africa, on the edge of the vast Mediterranean, a city was born that would one day rival the might of Rome itself. They called it Carthage, the new city, a name that carried both ambition and prophecy. Founded around 814 BCE by settlers from the Phoenician city of Tyre, Carthage was not built merely as a colony, but as a vision. The Phoenicians were seafarers, traders, and dreamers who saw in the endless horizon not danger, but opportunity. They carried with them the spirit of exploration, the hunger for trade, and the precision of a civilization that understood the language of the winds and the tides. In this fertile coastal land, surrounded by olive groves and kissed by the sea, they found the perfect place to build an empire. The Phoenicians were masters of trade long before Carthage's foundations were laid. From the ports of Tyre and Sidon, their purple-dyed cloth and intricate glasswork were prized across the ancient world. They were the invisible arteries of commerce connecting Egypt, Greece, Spain, and beyond. When Tyre's influence began to wane, Carthage emerged not as a reflection, but as a successor, a new heart beating with the rhythm of ambition. Its people inherited the Phoenician gift for navigation, but added to it something far more dangerous, the desire for power. Carthage's rise was not swift, but it was steady and unstoppable. Its harbors were feats of engineering brilliance. The inner circular harbor, reserved for the navy, was an architectural marvel, capable of housing over 200 warships, each ready to strike across the Mediterranean at a moment's notice. The outer commercial harbor bustled with merchants and sailors from every corner of the known world, their ships heavy with gold, silver, tin, spices, and slaves. From Iberia to Sardinia, from Sicily to the coasts of Africa, Carthaginian influence spread like ink on parchment. The city became a living, breathing organism, pulsing with trade, guarded by stone walls that seemed to touch the sky, and ruled by an oligarchy that balanced wealth with war. At the heart of this empire stood Baal-Hamon and Tanit, the gods who watched over Carthage's prosperity and power. Religion was not just belief. It was a contract between man and deity. Every victory, every storm survived at sea, every harvest reaped was seen as divine favor. But that favor demanded sacrifice. Beneath the temple altars, fires burned, and whispers of rituals spread through the Mediterranean. Rituals that some claimed involved the offering of children to ensure the gods' blessing. Whether truth or propaganda spread by their enemies, these stories painted Carthage in an air of mystery and terror that would later fuel its destruction. But behind the myths stood undeniable brilliance. Carthage was not a city of barbarians. It was a civilization of architects, economists, and scientists. They built roads that threaded through their empire, developed one of the most advanced agricultural systems of their age, and even wrote manuals on farming that later influenced Roman practices. Their ships ruled the seas not only because they were powerful, but because they were efficient, double-rowed vessels that combined speed with endurance. Their merchants didn't just trade goods. They traded ideas, languages, and technologies. And in this web of wealth and intellect, Carthage became the beating heart of the Western Mediterranean. The Carthaginian people were pragmatic. They believed power came not from brute strength, but from control. Control of trade, of resources, of alliances. Yet their empire was not built on loyalty. It was built on profit. Their colonies, from North Africa to Spain, paid tribute in exchange for protection, but when Carthage demanded more, rebellion was never far. Still, through diplomacy and naval dominance, they held their territories together. The city's ruling families, the Maganids, the Barcids, and others, guided its destiny with cunning precision. They sent expeditions beyond the known world, reaching as far as the British Isles and West Africa. In their pursuit of wealth, they charted coastlines and discovered lands the Greeks only dreamed of. But as Carthage grew stronger, so did the resentment of its rivals. The Greeks in Sicily saw them as intruders, merchants who corrupted with gold what they could not conquer with sword. Wars flared between them, but Carthage endured. Yet beyond the seas, another power was rising, silent, disciplined, and hungry. Rome, a small city-state on the Italian peninsula, began to expand its reach, consuming its neighbors with military efficiency. Two predators now shared the same sea, and only one would survive. The first sparks of conflict began over Sicily. It was a jewel both coveted and strategically vital. The First Punic War erupted, a clash not just of armies, but of ideologies. Rome, a land power with little naval experience, built an entire fleet from scratch to challenge Carthage's dominance. For 23 years, the two empires wrestled for control of the Mediterranean. Carthage, despite its superior seamanship, faced a new kind of enemy, one that would not stop until victory was absolute. The war drained their coffers, weakened their influence, but Carthage endured once more. Peace was signed, but it was uneasy, temporary, a pause before the storm. In the years that followed, Carthage turned its gaze westward to rebuild. Under the leadership of Hamilcar Barca and later his son Hannibal, new territories were conquered in Spain, giving Carthage a new source of wealth and soldiers. A new generation of Carthaginians was rising, fierce, loyal, and burning with hatred for Rome. In their hearts, the fire of vengeance was already lit. Yet, within the marble streets of Carthage, many believed the worst was over. Trade returned, ships once again filled the harbors, and markets thrived. The city glimmered under the sun as if the gods had forgiven them, but the truth was darker. Carthage had survived the first great storm, but the tides of fate were shifting. Rome had learned, adapted, and grown stronger. The Mediterranean was not large enough for two empires, and while Carthage rebuilt in wealth and pride, Rome rebuilt in silence, planning, waiting, preparing for a reckoning that would shake the ancient world. Carthage had risen from the sands of Africa to command the seas of the known world. It had transformed from a colony of traders into a symbol of power and ambition. But every empire carries within it the seeds of its own downfall. For Carthage, that seed had already been planted, not in its soil, but in the heart of Rome. The peace that followed the First Punic War was an illusion, an uneasy truce between two powers destined to destroy one another. Carthage had lost Sicily and much of its fleet, but not its will. Rome had won, but victory had come at a price that left both exhausted. In the shadows of this fragile calm, the next chapter of their rivalry began to take shape, forged by vengeance and ambition. It was in this volatile aftermath that one man would rise, a man whose name would echo through eternity. Hannibal Barca, the son of Hamilcar, heir to a legacy of defiance. Hamilcar Barca had led Carthaginian forces in the dying days of the First Punic War and knew Rome's might firsthand. When Carthage's defeat forced him to retreat, he turned his gaze toward Iberia, modern-day Spain, a land rich in silver, soldiers, and opportunity. There he began rebuilding Carthage's power far from Roman reach. He raised new armies, built alliances, and founded new cities, most famously Carthago Nova. But beyond expansion, Hamilcar had one enduring mission: to prepare his son for revenge. Legend says that before Hannibal could even grow into a man, his father made him swear an oath at the altar of their god, Baal Hammon. Never to be a friend of Rome, that promise would change the world. When Hamilcar died, his mantle passed to Hannibal, who possessed the same daring spirit and sharper intellect. At just 26, Hannibal took command of Carthage's forces in Iberia. He was charismatic, fearless, and obsessed with outmaneuvering his enemies. Under his rule, Carthage's presence in Spain flourished. But every fortress he built, every alliance he forged, made Rome uneasy. Rome demanded Carthage cease its expansion. Hannibal ignored them. When his forces attacked Saguntum, a city allied to Rome, the ancient world held its breath. Rome declared war. The Second Punic War had begun, and the Mediterranean would never be the same. Hannibal's strategy defied reason. Instead of meeting Rome at sea, where Carthage had once held dominance, he decided to bring the war to Italy itself. But the route he chose was madness in the eyes of his generals. To reach Italy, he would have to cross the Pyrenees, the treacherous Rhone River, and then the towering frozen Alps, an impossible feat for any army, let alone one burdened with cavalry, supplies, and war elephants. Yet Hannibal's determination was unshakable. His message was simple. Rome would not come to Carthage. Carthage would come to Rome. The journey was a nightmare. Blizzards blinded men. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, and lives. Avalanches swept entire units to their deaths. The elephants, symbols of Carthage's might, suffered terribly, slipping on icy paths, their roars echoing against the mountains. But Hannibal pressed on, rallying his men with the promise of glory and vengeance. Against all odds, what remained of his army, tattered, starving but unbroken, emerged from the Alps into northern Italy. The Romans, confident in their superiority, were stunned. No enemy had ever invaded their homeland with such audacity. Hannibal had done the unthinkable. His arrival marked the beginning of one of the most brilliant military campaigns in history. At the river Trebia, Hannibal lured the Romans into icy waters and annihilated them. At Lake Trasimene, he set a deadly ambush, slaughtering thousands in one of the greatest traps ever executed. The hills of Italy ran red with Roman blood, and the Senate trembled. Rome was facing not just a general, but a genius who understood the art of psychological warfare. Hannibal's tactics were fluid, unpredictable. He studied his enemies, adapted to their weaknesses, and struck where they least expected. Then came Cannae, the battle that would etch his name into legend. Facing a Roman army nearly twice the size of his own, Hannibal employed a tactic so devastating it would be studied by military strategists for centuries. He arranged his troops in a crescent formation, inviting Rome's legions to attack his center. As they advanced, his line bent but did not break. When the Romans were deep within, Hannibal's cavalry struck from behind, encircling them completely. It was a massacre, an entire Roman army annihilated, tens of thousands killed in a single day. It was said that the fields of Cannae were so soaked in blood that the soil itself turned dark. Rome's greatest generals lay dead. For a moment it seemed the eternal city itself might fall. But even in defeat, Rome's strength lay in resilience. They refused to surrender. The Senate rejected all peace offers. They raised new armies, trained fresh recruits, and turned the war into one of attrition. Hannibal, though victorious on the battlefield, faced a new enemy, time. He was deep in hostile territory, far from reinforcements. Carthage, fearful of overcommitting, failed to send the support he needed. Instead, they hesitated, debating politics while their greatest general fought alone. His allies in Italy began to waver, their loyalty eroded by Roman threats and promises. One by one, cities that had once cheered his victories began to fall silent. For over 15 years, Hannibal remained in Italy, haunting Rome like a phantom. His name alone was enough to terrify children and senators alike. Yet he could not deliver the final blow. The tide began to turn when Rome sent one of its most cunning generals, Publius Cornelius Scipio, to Spain. Scipio's campaign there cut off Carthage's access to resources and allies. When Scipio later crossed into Africa, Carthage had no choice but to recall Hannibal from Italy to defend his homeland. For the first time in decades, the great general who had crossed the Alps now faced the battle he had always sought to avoid. fighting on Carthaginian soil. The two titans met at Zama in 202 BCE. Hannibal, though experienced and strategic, faced a younger, better supplied opponent who had studied every one of his tactics. The elephants that had once struck terror into Roman hearts were rendered useless by Scipio's formations. When the dust settled, Carthage's army was broken. Hannibal, the man who had once brought Rome to its knees, was forced to flee. The war was over. Rome stood victorious, and Carthage was stripped of its fleet, its armies, and its freedom. The cost was devastating. The Carthaginians were forced to pay massive reparations, their empire dismantled piece by piece. The once great city that had ruled the seas was now a shadow of itself, humiliated but not entirely dead. Hannibal, refusing to live as a Roman puppet, escaped into exile. He continued to advise other kingdoms, still plotting against Rome in his heart. But the world he once ruled was gone. Hunted by his enemies, betrayed by allies, Hannibal chose death over capture, drinking poison with his final words echoing the defiance of his people. Let us free Rome from her fear, since she cannot wait for the death of an old man. The Second Punic War had ended, but its scars were eternal. Rome had won, yet it had also learned the price of underestimating an enemy. Carthage had lost, but its spirit, its daring, its brilliance remained unmatched. The rivalry between the two civilizations had reshaped the Mediterranean, setting the stage for the final act of destruction yet to come. For Rome, victory was not enough. Vengeance demanded more. The seed of Carthage's ultimate annihilation had been planted at Zama, and in the years ahead, it would grow into a fire that would consume an entire civilization. The years that followed the Battle of Zama marked the slow suffocation of Carthage. Once a proud and thriving empire, it was now reduced to a weakened state, its fleet destroyed, its armies disbanded, its coffers emptied into Rome's greedy hands. The Carthaginians were allowed to live but not to breathe. Every decision, every trade, every military movement required Roman approval. The city that had once ruled the seas now sat in silence under the shadow of its conqueror. Yet beneath the surface, the embers of pride still glowed. Carthage was defeated, but it was not dead. Its people rebuilt their homes, reopened their markets, and began to prosper once again. The city's wealth returned, its harbors filled with ships, and its merchants once more dominated Mediterranean trade. For Rome, that was unacceptable. To the Romans, Carthage's revival was a threat that could not be ignored. The Senate in Rome watched with suspicion as the city they had crippled began to rise from its ashes. Voices within Rome, most famously that of Cato the Elder, began to chant a single phrase that echoed through the Senate halls: Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. It was not enough that Carthage had been beaten. It had to be erased, its name forgotten, its people scattered. The Romans feared that prosperity would breed rebellion, that wealth would once again turn into power, and that the ghost of Hannibal might rise from memory to haunt them anew. Carthage, though careful, could not remain forever submissive. Its people had endured years of humiliation, constant interference, and Roman greed. Neighboring Numidia, Rome's favored ally, began encroaching on Carthaginian land. The Carthaginians appealed to Rome for protection, but the Senate, in their arrogance, sided with Numidia every time. The message was clear. Carthage was to remain defenseless, humiliated, and under constant pressure. But there is only so much a people can endure before desperation becomes rebellion. When the Numidian king attacked again, Carthage fought back, breaking the Roman treaty that forbade them from waging war without Roman consent. That was all the excuse Rome needed. In 149 BCE, Rome declared the Third Punic War. But this was not a war for territory or justice. It was a war of extermination. Roman legions crossed into North Africa with one purpose: to erase Carthage from existence. When their ships appeared on the horizon, the people of Carthage knew their fate was sealed. Still, they refused to surrender without a fight. The Romans demanded that the city hand over its weapons. Carthage complied, delivering thousands of swords, spears, and shields. But then Rome issued another demand: abandon the city, move inland, and leave the coast forever. It was a death sentence. Carthage's leaders, realizing there would be no mercy, declared war. The city erupted into a frenzy of resistance. Every man, woman, and child took part in the desperate preparation for the siege. The city's walls, towering and strong, became its last hope. Blacksmiths worked day and night to forge weapons from whatever metal they could find, tools, chains, even ornaments. Women cut their hair to make ropes for catapults. Temples became foundries. Markets turned into armories. The once prosperous trade capital of the Mediterranean transformed into a fortress of defiance. For Carthage, this was no longer about empire or wealth, it was about survival. The siege began, and with it came horror. For 3 long years, Rome surrounded the city, cutting off all supplies. Famine spread. People starved in the streets. The dead piled up faster than they could be buried. Yet still, the Carthaginians refused to surrender. Every Roman assault was met with fierce resistance. The defenders fought from rooftops, from windows, from narrow alleyways where the Roman legions could not form their disciplined lines. They poured boiling oil and stones upon their enemies, turned every street into a battlefield. The courage of the Carthaginians astonished even their foes. Inside the city, despair and determination mixed into something almost supernatural. Families hid together in their homes, praying to Tanit and Baal Hammon for deliverance. The priests burned incense, offering desperate pleas to gods that no longer seemed to hear them. Children cried for food, and mothers tore apart their clothes to bind the wounds of the dying. The city that had once feasted on the riches of the world now fed on its own desperation. Yet not one voice rose to call for surrender. They would rather die free than live as slaves under Rome's rule. In 146 BCE, after 3 years of siege, the final assault began. The Roman commander Scipio Aemilianus, grandson of the great Scipio who had defeated Hannibal, led the charge. His legions stormed the weakened walls and poured into the city. What followed was a slaughter. Street by street, building by building, the Romans advanced, cutting down everyone in their path. The Carthaginians fought with the strength of the condemned, refusing to yield even as their world collapsed around them. The battle raged for 6 days. By the end, Carthage was a graveyard. When the fighting stopped, only a handful of defenders remained. The last survivors gathered in the Temple of Eshmun, the city's highest sanctuary. As the Romans broke through the gates, the Carthaginians set fire to the temple, choosing death over captivity. Flames consumed the walls, the statues, the sacred relics, and the people themselves. The city that had once been the jewel of the Mediterranean burned for 17 days. When the smoke cleared, all that remained was ash and ruin. The Romans destroyed everything: homes, temples, archives, even the city's foundations. They sold 50,000 survivors into slavery, and then, in a symbolic act that would echo through time, they cursed the land. Some accounts claim the Romans sowed the earth with salt so that nothing would ever grow there again. Whether myth or fact, the message was unmistakable. Carthage was not to rise again. The world had lost more than a city. It had lost a culture, a people, a language, a legacy. The knowledge of the Carthaginians, of their science, their navigation, their architecture, was scattered and forgotten. Rome wrote the history that followed, painting Carthage as a greedy, cruel, and barbaric civilization deserving of destruction. But history, as always, is written by the victors. Beneath the ashes of propaganda lies another truth. Carthage was a beacon of innovation and trade, a bridge between worlds, and a testament to human endurance. Its destruction was not justice, it was fear. Centuries later, archaeologists would uncover the buried ruins of Carthage, finding fragments of walls, pottery, and inscriptions, mute witnesses to a civilization that once shaped the ancient world. They revealed evidence of advanced urban planning, intricate art, and thriving industry. Slowly, the real story began to emerge from beneath Rome's lies. Carthage was not the monster it was made to be. It was a masterpiece of human ambition, crushed beneath the weight of another's greed. In the end, Rome may have destroyed the city, but not the idea it represented. The idea that power can rise from the sea, that knowledge can rival conquest, and that even in defeat, memory endures. The fall of Carthage was not just the end of a civilization. It was a warning whispered through time. Empires rise on ambition and fall to arrogance. And as the ruins of Carthage still lie beneath the Tunisian sun, they remind us that no empire, no matter how mighty, lasts forever. The fires of Carthage may have long turned to dust, but their glow still flickers beneath the sands of Tunisia. For every ruin unearthed, every artifact discovered, another question rises from the ashes. Who truly destroyed Carthage? Rome's sword or humanity's hunger for dominance? And if one empire could be so completely erased, how many others still lie buried, waiting to tell their story before time swallows them forever? The earth remembers what history forgets, and beneath its silent layers, the next great secret is already stirring.